Hello everyone. Today I'm continuing my series on eschatology, the study of the end times, and I'm continuing my sub-series on the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse. In this video, I'm talking about the second half of the Olivet Discourse and arguing that the whole discourse is about events in the first century instead of being divided into two different topics. And I'll defend a preterist interpretation of Matthew 24:36 through 25:31, Mark 13:32-37, and Luke 21:34-36, and also Luke 17. So Mark 13:32-37 says, "But of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. See to it, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It is like a man away on a journey who, leaving his house and giving authority to his slaves, each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake." This is the end of the discourse in Mark's Gospel, but Matthew's version goes on much longer. Matthew 24:36, 42-44 says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will." After this, for the rest of Matthew 24 and most of Matthew 25, Jesus tells several parables about this coming. And Luke 21:34-36 says, "But be on guard, so that your hearts will not be overcome with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of life, and that day will not come on you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all those who inhabit the face of all the earth. But keep on the alert at all times, praying earnestly that you may have strength to escape all these things that are about to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man." This is the end of the discourse in Luke, which is shorter like Mark's version is. Now, before I get into new evidence for the unity of the discourse, I'll recap the evidence for this that I've already hinted at in previous videos. First, in my 9th eschatology video, I explained that Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source and often expanded on or clarified things in Mark. Luke did so for a Gentile audience and Matthew for a Jewish audience. Usually, when it is argued that the discourse is divided, it is said that Jesus answers the disciples' first question in the first half and then answers their second question in the second half, and the second question is not about first century events like the first question was, although the disciples may have mistakenly thought that it was, and Jesus was correcting them. However, while in Matthew the second question is about the coming of the Son of Man and the end of the age, Mark and Luke simply repeat the phrase used in the first question, which is "these things," and in all three versions Jesus says all these things would happen in their generation, which would necessarily include the coming of the Son of Man and the end of the age based on the parallels between the Gospels. Here is the chart I showed before. Clearly, Matthew was simply clarifying for his Jewish audience what these things included, since they had been looking forward to the fulfillment of the book of Daniel, which explicitly prophesies the end of the age, the coming of the Son of Man, the Great Tribulation, and the abomination of desolation during the Roman Empire in conjunction with each other, and Jesus explicitly refers to the book of Daniel multiple times in both halves of the discourse, but especially throughout the first half. Second, in my 13th eschatology video, I showed that the coming of the Son of Man in Daniel 7 can only be referring to the AD 70 coming against Jerusalem, and that every time Jesus refers to a coming of the Son of Man, he can only be referring to this prophecy, and therefore whenever Jesus mentions the coming of the Son of Man, he is talking about his AD 70 coming and not his final advent. But as I just read, Jesus talks about the coming of the Son of Man in the second half of the discourse in all three versions, and therefore the second half of the discourse must still be about first century events, because Jesus can't be referring to something else with that language from Daniel. Third, Daniel 12 expands on things earlier in Daniel and cannot be separated from Daniel 11 or the fourth beast, which is Rome. And as I said, Daniel 12 mentions the Great Tribulation and the abomination of desolation, which Jesus explicitly interprets as referring to first century events in the first half of the discourse. But at the same time, Daniel 12 also talks about the end of the age, both before and immediately after it talks about the abomination of desolation. The disciples clearly would have connected the two things in their minds, just as the intertestamental Jews did, which is the whole reason why they asked about the end of the age right after Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, because this destruction would necessarily involve the abomination of desolation, and because the abomination of desolation and the end of the age were both supposed to occur during the Roman Empire, according to Daniel. Now, as I said, it is often argued that the disciples were confused and shouldn't be conflating these things together even though Daniel does, and Jesus was correcting their confusion and saying the end of the age would not be at the destruction of the temple. But there are various reasons why this is clearly not possible. First, Jesus makes no explicit statement that their questions were mistaken, and then applies Daniel 12, which itself conflates the two things, to the first century. So if Jesus actually meant to correct an error on their part, then by saying what he said and not saying what he didn't say, he did an absolutely awful job. Why wouldn't he just explicitly state that the destruction of the temple is not the end of the age? Second, if the disciples were confused, then Daniel himself and the angel who was talking to him would have also been confused, which is absurd. Third, in Matthew 24:14, Jesus explicitly says the end would come in their generation, according to verse 34. Fourth, there are various other places where the disciples actually are confused and Jesus has to correct them, but the pattern that exists in all these passages is totally absent from the Olivet Discourse. Jesus consistently corrects the disciples' misunderstandings with explicit rebukes or clarifications. For example, Matthew 16:21-24 says, "From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you.' But he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests but man's.' Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.'" Peter was confused about the nature of the first advent of Christ, and Jesus immediately corrected him on it, and he did so harshly. And then he talked to all of the disciples to clarify the truth. And Matthew 17:3-6 says, "And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, 'Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 booths here, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.' And when the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified." Peter was again in error, this time regarding idolatry of Moses and Elijah, and before he was even done speaking, God spoke from heaven and corrected him by saying that the disciples should follow Jesus uniquely. Then Mark 10:35-44 says, "Then James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus, saying to him, 'Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you.' And he said to them, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And they said to him, 'Grant that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory.' But Jesus said to them, 'You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?' And they said to him, 'We are able.' And Jesus said to them, 'The cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared.' And hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John, and calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, 'You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you, for whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all.'" This time James and John were in error, and Jesus corrects their arrogance by saying, "You do not know what you are asking." And then the other disciples were also wrong to be so angry, and Jesus corrects them as well and teaches all the disciples to be humble. But in the Olivet Discourse, when they ask their questions, he does not say, "You do not know what you are asking." And for 2 more examples, Mark 9:30-37 says, "From there they went out and were going through Galilee, and he was not wanting anyone to know about it, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, 'The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he has been killed he will rise again 3 days later.' But they did not understand this statement and were afraid to ask him. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house he began to question them, 'What were you discussing on the way?' But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. And sitting down he called the 12 and said to them, 'If anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all.' And taking a child, he set him before them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, 'Whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me does not receive me but him who sent me.'" In the first part of this passage, in an example where the disciples were confused and Jesus does not correct them, it explicitly states that the disciples were confused. And in the second part is yet another example where they were in error and Jesus explicitly corrects them. This is a clear pattern that is consistently followed. But Jesus does not explicitly correct or rebuke the disciples like this anywhere in any version of the Olivet Discourse, nor does the text ever state that they were confused. Rather, Jesus clearly interprets Daniel the way they did and explicitly says that the end and all these things would happen within their generation. Furthermore, Jesus actually talked extensively about the end of the age prior to the Olivet Discourse back in Matthew 13:24-50. Then immediately after his teaching about the end of the age, verses 51 and 52 say, "Have you understood all these things?" They said to him, "Yes." And he said to them, "Therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of a household who brings out of his treasure things new and old." The text explicitly states that the disciples did understand the end of the age. How could they then be totally confused about it later? And if they were, why didn't the text state this like it does elsewhere? Why did Jesus once again affirm their understanding of it, just like he did in Matthew 13? So given all of this evidence, the idea that the disciples were confused and their questions were wrong, and Jesus is correcting them in the discourse, is completely absurd. And anyone who isn't blinded by tradition will see that. It's an absolutely untenable position for which there is literally zero evidence. None whatsoever. So now that I've established that the disciples weren't confused and reviewed the evidence covered in prior videos, now let's get into further evidence that the Olivet Discourse must be united and not divided. The next argument is based on the literary structure of the discourse itself, as well as the entirety of Matthew's Gospel. I'm convinced that the discourse has a chiastic structure, and also that Matthew's Gospel has a chiastic structure in which the Sermon on the Mount parallels the Olivet Discourse and has its own chiastic structure. Now, in case you don't know, a chiastic structure is an ancient literary technique in which two ideas, let's call them A and B, together with parallel ideas A' and B', are presented in the order of A, B, B', A', so that the text is symmetrically balanced with ideas or themes that are paralleled or completed in the reverse order compared to how they were first presented. There can also be structures where one idea is put in the center without a parallel in order to emphasize it, such as A, B, C, B', A'. The climax of the structure is always the middle, and the parallels have to be consistent and unified when they exist. So if the Olivet Discourse has a chiastic structure, then there is no way to divide the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy into two separate events thousands of years apart. Furthermore, I'm also convinced that the whole Gospel of Matthew is carefully structured so as to specifically present Jesus as the new and true Israel of God by having him recapitulate Old Testament history. In his book, Reading Matthew, Trusting Jesus, Christian Tradition and First Century Fulfillment within Matthew 24-25, Jonathan Sedlak says, Peter Ellis provides a symmetrical, chiastic outline of Matthew's Gospel that illustrates the way in which Matthew has framed the entirety of his message. Then Sedlak presents Ellis's chart. The center of the chiasm F is the sermon in chapter 13, the third of Jesus' 5 discourses. Then E and E prime are the narrative sections in chapters 11-12 and 14-17. D and D prime are the discourses in chapters 10 and 18. C and C prime are the narrative sections in chapters 8-9 and 19-22. B and B prime are the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5-7 and the Olivet Discourse in chapters 23-25. And lastly, A and A prime are the opening and closing narrative sections in chapters 1-4 and 26-28. Then Sedlak continues, Ellis rightly observes that the sermons, that is, the discourses, woven throughout this gospel are artfully balanced both in length and subject matter, with the first 5-7 and the last 23-25 concerned principally with the theme of discipleship, and the second, chapter 10, and the fourth, chapter 18, with the mission of the apostles and the use of apostolic authority in the community, and the central discourse, chapter 13, with the church as kingdom of heaven on earth. Such an arrangement and symmetry can hardly be a matter of chance. In light of these intentional literary designs, this ought to lead us to ask further questions. For example, if the first discourse, the Sermon on the Mount, is artfully balanced with the Sermon on the Mount of Olives, that is, the Olivet Discourse, and the first Sermon on the Mount is intentionally modeled after the revelation at Sinai where Israel's God delivered his law to them, what portions of Israel's history are the remaining 4 discourses modeled after, and what portion of Israel's history is the Olivet Discourse specifically modeled after? According to Lightheart, the 5 major discourses or pillars of Matthew's literary structure are as follows. 1. Matthew 5-7, Sermon on the Mount. 2. Matthew 10, Mission of the 12, Preparation. 3. Matthew 13, Parables, Proverbs, and Wisdom of the Coming Kingdom. 4. Matthew 18, Instructions for a Divided Kingdom. And 5. Matthew 23-25, Olivet Discourse, Woes and Prophecy about the House of Israel. If we then take into account the theme of the first 4 narrative chapters, as well as the 3 closing narrative chapters of the Gospel, the 5 pillars of discourse would be sandwiched in the middle. If we translate this general structure of Matthew's Gospel from Israel's history and expand it according to a typological framework contained in Israel's scriptures, as Lightheart suggests, its chiastic arrangement would look something like the following. A. Beginnings, birth, and youth of God's Son equals Israel's Genesis, Mount Sinai. B. Sermon on the Mount equals giving the law at Mount Sinai. C. Mission of the 12, preparation equals Deuteronomy, preparation for conquest. D. Parables, etc. for the coming kingdom equals wisdom/Solomonic kingdom. C prime, instructions for a divided kingdom equals Israel's kingdom is hopelessly divided. B prime, Olivet Discourse, woes and prophecy about the house of Israel equals the end of the Judean kingdom / warnings of temple destruction and Babylonian exile. A prime, death, resurrection, and great commission of God's Son equals death and resurrection of Israel and the great commission of the Lord's anointed Cyrus. There seem to be intentional parallels between each corresponding section within this chiastic framework. It should be clear that it is at least possible, if not probable, that Matthew has organized his gospel in an intentionally intricate manner. The literary structure of the Sermon on the Mount is as follows. A. Jesus ascends mountain surrounded by crowds, 4:25-5:2. B. 8 blessings, 5:3-10. C. Response to persecution on Jesus' account, not destroying the law and the prophets, but glorifying your Father in heaven, 5:11-20. D. 2 triads about law-keeping, 5:21-48. E. 1 triad about spiritual discipline, 6:1-18. D prime, 2 triads about kingdom prioritization, 6:19-7:6. C prime, response to persecution on Jesus' account. This is the law and the prophets that your Father in heaven provides, 7:7-12. B prime, 8 warnings, 7:13-27. And A prime, Jesus descends the mountain surrounded by crowds, 7:28-8:1. And regarding the Olivet Discourse, Sedlak says, this context and audience, as we have seen, was clearly noticed by patristic exegetes. What remains to be seen is whether Matthew introduces any different context or audience, that is to say, any other context than Judaism's cultic epicenter or the people of Israel within the first century. The literary structure of Matthew's Olivet Discourse is as follows. A. Those seated in Moses' seat, not doing what they do, 23:1-12. B. Jesus denounces those seated in Moses' seat, 8 sections of woes, 23:13-39. C. Jesus asks his disciples a question about the temple, then promises its desolation, 24:1-2. C prime, the disciples ask Jesus questions, 24:3. B prime, Jesus answers the disciples' questions, 8 sections of prophetic response, 24:4-25:30. A prime, the Son of Man seated on his own throne, doing what they did not do, 25:31-46. Now again, when it is argued that the Olivet Discourse is divided, it is usually asserted that Jesus answers the first question first, and then the second question in the part that is allegedly about the future. But it is important to notice that the disciples' questions and Jesus' answers are actually arranged chiastically. Jesus answers them in reverse order. Sedlak counts them as 3 questions rather than 2, which I do disagree with, but this does not really affect how to interpret the passage, since the second of the 2 questions does still contain 2 different parts that Jesus answers separately and in reverse order. So Sedlak says, the first and most influential misunderstanding is this. Jesus does not answer the first question first. Jesus answers the third question first, and the first question third. This is evident in both the language, structure, and conceptual nature of the answers given. I will begin by laying out the literary structure of section B' below. B', Jesus answers all 3 questions, 8 sections of prophetic response, 24:4 to 25:30. 1. Answering the third question, part 1, signs preceding the end of the age, 24:4 to 14. 2. Answering the third question, part 2, the sign of the end of the age, 24:15 to 22. 3. Answering the second question, part 1, signs preceding Christ's parousia, 24:23 to 29. Parousia is the Greek word used for Christ coming here. Then 4. Answering the second question, part 2, the sign of Christ's parousia, 24:30 to 35. 5. Answering the first question, part 1, watch therefore, you do not know the day or the hour, 24:36 to 44. 6. Answering the first question, part 2, the master and his servants, wailing and gnashing of teeth, 24:45 to 51. 7. Answering the first question, part 3, watch therefore, you do not know the day or the hour, 25:1 to 13. 8. Answering the first question, part 4, the master and his servants, wailing and gnashing of teeth, 25:14 to 30. There are multiple aspects of this literary structure that reinforce its connection with the disciples' questions, as shown above. As you can see, Jesus answers the second part of the second question first, about the sign of the end of the age, then the first part of the second question, about the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. He follows a clear A, B, A', B' pattern in each answer, where he first talks about various signs preceding these events before talking about the specific sign of each event. A parallel A, B, A', B' pattern is also followed in his answer to the first question about the timing of the events described. 2 times in a row, he first gives an illustration about why the disciples should watch for the signs he just gave them, saying no one knows the day or the hour, and then he gives a parable about a master and his servants, with the wicked servants being punished. The chiasm of the whole discourse is pretty clear. The 8 woes in chapter 23 parallel the 8 sections of Jesus' response to the disciples' questions, and the seat of the Son of Man parallels the seat of Moses. The central point of the discourse is Jesus' explicit prophecy of the destruction of the temple, because that is what the whole discourse is about. With this chiasm established, it is impossible to make the second half of Jesus' answer be about something else. That would absolutely destroy the chiastic unity not only of the discourse but of the whole gospel, since the Olivet Discourse is parallel to the Sermon on the Mount, which itself has chiastic unity and reflects the giving of the law to Old Covenant Israel on Mount Sinai. The whole Olivet Discourse, therefore, must be about the dissolution of Old Covenant Israel. Now, you may object that Jesus actually is answering the first question first, because the first question is, when will these things be? And in verse 34, which Sedlak includes under the answer to the second question, Jesus says this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. However, there are 5 reasons why this isn't a problem. 1 is that even if this is true, it doesn't disturb the chiastic structure of the overall discourse, since this is a separate chiastic structure within that one. 2, Sedlak may simply be wrong about where the exact cutoff for each question is, even though he is right about the questions being answered in reverse order, which he clearly is. 3, in Mark and Luke, the second question also includes the phrase "these things," just like the first question does. 4, Jesus is probably simply anticipating and starting to shift towards an answer to the first question, as he is finishing his answer to the second question. If indeed the whole discourse is united and about the same events, it makes perfect sense that he would do this, since both questions and both answers are all about the same thing. There are also other parallels like this between the 2 sections, which just further demonstrate that they are connected, so the answers to the questions are intertwined to a certain extent. And 5, verse 34 is not directly an answer to the first question anyway, in the way that verse 36 clearly is. The phrase "these things" in verse 34 refers to all the signs that Jesus had just finished talking about, and the signs were asked about in the second of the 2 questions, not the first. And he doesn't say "this generation is when all these things will be," paralleling the first question, but rather he simply says "this generation will not pass away until you see all these signs." But in verse 36, he is clearly addressing the first question directly and not the second question anymore, when he says, "of that day and hour no one knows." Now, my next major argument for the unity of the discourse is that the discourse very closely parallels Luke 17, but the order of events in Luke 17 is different, with some of the stuff in the second part of Jesus' answer being placed before things in the first part of Jesus' answer. There is no indication whatsoever in Luke 17 that 2 different comings are in view, and it is also clear from the context of Luke 17 that Jesus is talking about his first century coming and not his final advent. So let's compare 6 key sections in each of the 2 passages. In Matthew 24, first we have verses 17 to 18, which say, "Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house, and whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his garment." Second, verses 26 to 27 say, "Therefore if they say to you, Behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out, or Behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and appears even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be." Third, right after that, verse 28 says, "Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Then fourth, we have the "this generation" statement in verse 34, followed immediately by the alleged division in verses 35 to 36. And fifth, right after this, verses 37 to 39 say, "For just as the days of Noah were, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be." Then sixth, right after that, verses 40 to 41 say, "Then there will be two in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding grain at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left." But in Luke 17, Jesus arranges these same six things differently. He starts with the second one in Luke 17, 22 to 24, which says, "And he said to the disciples, The days will come when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. And they will say to you, Look there, look here. Do not go away, and do not run after them. For just like the lightning, when it flashes out of one part of the sky, shines to the other part of the sky, so will the Son of Man be in his day." Then he immediately moves to the fourth one in verse 25, which says, "But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation." And the fifth one in verses 26 to 27, which say, "And just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were being given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all." After that, in verses 30 to 31, he finally covers the first one, saying, "It will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house must not go down to take them out, and likewise the one who is in the field must not turn back." Then in verses 34 to 35, he jumps to the sixth one, saying, "I tell you, on that night there will be two in one bed, one will be taken and the other will be left. There will be two women grinding grain at the same place, one will be taken and the other will be left." Verse 36 also has the statement from Matthew 24:40, but this verse was added later by a scribe who was trying to further harmonize Luke 17 with Matthew 24. So then immediately after verse 35, Jesus goes back to the third one to answer the disciples' question about the sixth one in verse 37, which says, "And answering they said to him, Where, Lord? And he said to them, Where the body is, there also the vultures will be gathered." As you can see, the third one is before the alleged division in Matthew 24:35 to 36, but is after 4, 5, and 6 in Luke 17. Clearly only one coming is in view in Luke 17, and these six sections are mixed up together in a different order because they are interchangeably about this one coming. However, Kenneth Gentry, who argues for a division in the discourse, believes that the coming in Luke 17 is the final advent rather than the 80-70 coming, and therefore the language used there from before the division in the discourse simply applies to both comings, whereas the language used after the division is only ever used of the final advent in both passages. But this is the only place in Luke that this material appears, since it is not used in Luke's version of the discourse in Luke 21, and Jesus uses the exact same language as in Matthew 24 while talking to the same audience, the disciples. And regarding the third of the six parallels, there is a big problem for Gentry's position. Like I explained in my 13th eschatology video, a literal translation of Matthew 24:28 is, "Wherever the corpse is, there the eagles will be gathered." I quoted Gentry making a very strong case that the eagles here have to be a reference to the first century Roman armies, because there are several other terms Jesus could have used instead, and this same Greek term for eagle is used in the covenant curse passage in Deuteronomy 28 in the Septuagint, and the Roman ensigns bore the eagle as the symbol of Rome. Gentry is correct in recognizing that Jesus is clearly describing the Roman armies gathering around the corpses in Jerusalem. But what Gentry refuses to admit is that the very same thing is true in Luke 17. A literal translation of verses 35 to 37 is, "There will be two women grinding grain at the same place. One will be taken and the other will be left. And answering they said to him, Where, Lord? And he said to them, Wherever the body is, there also the eagles will be gathered." And not only is Jesus' statement the same here as in Matthew 24:28 and equally points to the Roman armies, but here he says this while answering his disciples' question about where one would be taken and the other left, clearly indicating that this would happen in Jerusalem in the first century at the hands of the Romans. But the one taken and one left material is after the alleged division in Matthew 24, which shows that there cannot be a division in the discourse. And that's not all the evidence that Luke 17 is about the first century and not the final advent, because there's a problem with the first parallel as well. Matthew 24:16 to 18 says, "Those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house, and whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his garment." Gentry argues correctly that this must apply to the first century because it is explicitly a local event that the disciples could flee from, which is not true of the final advent. So how can identical language then apply to the final advent in Luke 17? Verses 28 to 31 say it was the same as in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. It will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house must not go down to take them out, and likewise the one who is in the field must not turn back. It is obvious that this is about the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus compares his coming to Lot and his family fleeing Sodom before it was destroyed. In Genesis, Lot's wife looks back at Sodom as they are fleeing the city, but Jesus tells his disciples not to look back as they are fleeing. In Matthew 24, it is clear they are fleeing Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is even called Sodom in Revelation 11:8. Furthermore, the coming in Luke 17 is repeatedly referred to as the coming of the Son of Man, which I've shown before is necessarily a reference to Daniel 7 and its fulfillment in AD 70. And there are still 3 other clues supporting the idea that he is talking about the first century here. First, the verses immediately following this passage, Luke 18, 1-8, are clearly about Christ's first century coming. Luke 18, 7-8 says, "Now will God not bring about justice for his elect who cry to him day and night? And will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find that faith on the earth?" Even Gentry himself argues that this is about the first century coming, and there is zero indication that Jesus switched to a different coming from the one he was talking about in the verses immediately prior to this. Second, in Luke 17, right after talking about his coming, Jesus says, "But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation," Luke 17:25. This part parallels the "this generation" statement in Matthew 24:34. And the way Jesus phrases it here sounds like it fits his first century coming better than the final advent. If he was talking about something thousands of years in the future, why would he have to say "but first" regarding his crucifixion, which was about to occur soon? It seems to presume that the 2 events being discussed are relatively close in time to each other. Third, right before talking about his coming, Jesus says in verse 22, "The days will come when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it." There would be a time when the disciples themselves would long to see one of the days, plural, of the Son of Man. These are clearly the same as those days of tribulation at the first century coming in Matthew 24, 29-30. The phrase "you will not see it" does not indicate that Jesus is talking about the final advent in their distant future, because they wouldn't live long enough to see it, but rather refers to what he said in the verses immediately prior to this. Luke 17, 20-21 says, "Now having been questioned by the Pharisees as to when the kingdom of God was coming, he answered them and said, The kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed, nor will they say, Look here or there, for behold, the kingdom of God is in your midst." This language actually parallels Matthew 24:23 and 26-27. The Pharisees were asking when the kingdom would come, and Jesus didn't say it was millennia away, correcting their expectation of imminence, see also Luke 11:20, but instead says it was already in their midst, correcting their expectation of the nature of the kingdom. So the phrase "you will not see it" means the disciples wouldn't see the Messiah militarily conquer the Roman Empire and establish a Jewish state like they were originally expecting. Also, the fact that Jesus says the kingdom was already present immediately before the passage in question is evidence that the passage is about the imminent first century coming to fully establish this kingdom. So given all of this evidence, it is very clear that Luke 17 is not at all about the final advent. Therefore, the same language used after Matthew 24:36 is used of the first century here, meaning the part after the alleged division of the discourse is easily applicable to the first century coming, which shows there is no division. In his book Last Days Madness, DeMar says, "Commentators often argue that Matthew 24 contains both a discussion of the AD 70 destruction of religious, social, and political Judaism, as well as a reference to a yet future return of Christ. This supposed distinction is drawn by contrasting this generation and that day and hour. Gentry writes that there seems to be an intended contrast between that which is near in verse 34 and that which is far in verse 36, this generation versus that day. It would seem more appropriate for Christ to have spoken of this day rather than that day, if he had meant to refer to the time of this generation. Not at all. We should expect to see that used for a time still in the speaker's future, whether that event is 40 years or 4,000 years in the future. This generation refers to the present generation Jesus was addressing. This is therefore the appropriate word for something present, while that is the most appropriate word for something future. Arndt and Gingrich agree, this referring to something comparatively near at hand, just as akanos, that, refers to something comparatively farther away. That day would come in the final destruction of the Jews who rejected their Messiah, a time still in the future for Jesus' audience. John Gill writes, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man," etc., which is to be understood not of the second coming of Christ, the end of the world and the last judgment, but of the coming of the Son of Man to take vengeance on the Jews and of their destruction. For the words manifestly regard the date of the several things going on before, which can only be applied to that catastrophe and dreadful desolation. Gill assumes that the previous context of the chapter governs the meaning of that day. Adam Clark offers a similar interpretation. Verse 36, "But of that day and hour." The Greek word ora is translated season by many eminent critics, and is used in this sense by both sacred and profane authors. As the day was not known in which Jerusalem should be invested by the Romans, therefore our Lord advised his disciples to pray that it might not be on a Sabbath, and as the season was not known, therefore they were to pray that it might not be in the winter. Verse 20. Another reason offered in support of dividing the chapter at 24:35 is that the signs that follow are of a general nature compared to specific signs detailed in 24:1-34. There are two very good reasons for the absence of signs. First, the signs have already been given. All the signs that were necessary to understand the general timing of Jesus' return and judgment were specified. Second, the topic changes from signs leading up to the temple's destruction to watchfulness and expectation during the interim. Gentry writes that we should notice the pre-transition emphasis on plural days in contrast to the focus on the singular day afterwards. This generation involves many days for the full accomplishment of the protracted Matthew 24:22 Great Tribulation. He states that in contrast to the many days of the Great Tribulation, that day of the future Second Advent will come in a moment in the twinkling of an eye. Notice, however, that the Great Tribulation of Matthew 24:15-28 does not include either the dissolution of the social, political, and religious world of the Jews 24:29 or the coming of the Son of Man 24:30. The events of 24:29-30, the coming of Jesus in judgment before that first century generation passes away, follow immediately after the tribulation of those days, 24:29. Such a distinction indicates that Jesus was pointing towards a certain day when the temple and the city of Jerusalem would fall. The description of the Great Tribulation leads up to the heart of the discourse which is found in 24:29-31. This is why Matthew describes the coming of the Son of Man as following the days of the Great Tribulation. To help his listeners better understand the timing and circumstances of the events leading up to and including the destruction of the temple before their generation passed away, Jesus draws on a familiar Old Testament judgment event, the flood. Jesus' teaching by analogy shows how the coming of the flood waters and his own coming are similar. In Noah's time, we read about those days which were before the flood and the day that Noah entered the ark, Matthew 24:38. Similarly, there were days before the coming of the Son of Man and the day of the coming of the Son of Man. The same people were involved in both of the days before and the day of the Son of Man. Those who were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage were the same people who were shut out on the day that Noah entered the ark. Noah entered the ark on a single day, similar to the way Jesus, as the Son of Man, came on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, 24:30, a day and hour known only to the Father, 24:36. Many futurists claim that the phrase took them all away, 24:39, refers to a rapture that is still in our future. On the contrary, in the context of 24:37-39, taken presumably means taken to judgment. The phrase ties the judgment of the world in Noah's day with the judgment of the Jews' world in Israel's day that took place with the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. Who was taken away in the judgment of the flood? Not Noah and his family. They were left behind to carry on God's work. John Gill writes in his commentary on this passage, "They shall be taken away by the eagles, the Roman army, and either killed or carried captive by them." The Bible gives its own commentary on the meaning of took them all away in Luke 17:27-29. Destroyed them all is equivalent to took them all away. In Luke 17:34-37, there are two pictured in the same bed, with one taken and the other left. Two are grinded together, and one is taken and the other left. Two are in the field, one is taken and the other left. Then in verse 37, the question is asked, "Where, Lord?" The answer is very dramatic, "And he said unto them, Wherever the body is, there will the eagles be gathered together." It should be very clear that the ones taken are put to death and their bodies are consumed by the vultures. If the ones taken are killed, then verses 40-41 of Matthew 24 speak of precisely the same kind of judgment as occurred in the flood, where the ones taken were taken in judgment. Since there was a judgment where Jews were in fact taken away in judgment, it makes much more sense to place the timing of such an event to the closest event, Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70. Another line of evidence offered by those who believe that events following Matthew 24:34 refer to the personal and physical return of Jesus is the meaning given to after a long time, 24:48, 25:19, and the delay by the bridegroom, 25:5. On the surface, these examples seem to indicate that two different events are in view, one near the destruction of Jerusalem and one distant, the second coming of Christ. Notice that the evil slave says, "My master is not coming for a long time," Matthew 24:48. The evil slave then proceeds to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, 24:49. But to the surprise of the evil slave, the master returned when he least expected him, 24:50. The master did not return to cut the evil slave's distant relatives in pieces, 24:51. He cut him in pieces. The evil slave was alive when the master left, and he was alive when the master returned. In this context, a long time must be measured against a person's lifetime. In context, 2 years could be a long time, if the master usually returned within 6 months. The same idea is expressed in the parable of the talents. A man entrusts his slaves with his possessions, 25:14. The master then goes on a journey, 25:15. While the master is gone, the slaves make investment decisions, 25:16-18. We are then told that after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them, 25:19. In this context, a long time is no longer than an average lifetime. The settlement is made with the slaves who received the talents. In every other New Testament context, a long time means nothing more than an extended period of time. Nowhere does it mean centuries or multiple generations. The delay of the bridegroom is no different from the long time of the two previous parables. The bridegroom returns to the same two groups of virgins, 25:1-13. The duration of the delay must be measured by the audience. Is the coming of the Son of Man in Matthew 24:37 different in time and kind from the coming of the Son of Man in verses 27 and 30? There is no indication that Jesus is describing two comings separated by an indeterminate period of time. What would have led the disciples to conclude that Jesus was describing a coming different from the one he described moments before, when he uses identical language to describe both of them? Jesus does not say this coming of the Son of Man or that coming of the Son of Man to distinguish two comings as he does with this generation and that day. Similarly, there is little evidence that the coming of the Son of Man in Matthew 24, 27, 30, 39, and 42 is different from the coming of the Son of Man in 25, 31. Compare 25, 31 with 16, 27, a certain reference to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then recompense every man according to his deeds, in Matthew 16:27. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, 25:31. These verses are almost identical. The timing of Matthew 16:27 is tied to verse 28. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The solution in determining when certain prophetic events take place is the presence of time indicators in context. The phrase long time has been made to stretch over several millennia, even though there was no indication of such an extended period of time in Matthew 24:48 and 25:19. While all admit that time indicators are present in Matthew 24 to 25, few are willing to allow the words and the context to set the limits on how long a long time is. The use of long time has no eschatological significance in other New Testament contexts. For example, Herod had wanted to see Jesus for a long time, Luke 23:8. The same can be said for the New Testament use of delay. The parables of Matthew 24 to 25 are clear on the duration of the delays. The two masters who go on a journey return to the same people they left. There is no need to allegorize these parables to force them to depict a distant coming of Christ. The virgins get drowsy at dusk, and the bridegroom returns at midnight, Matthew 25:6. How can this delay be turned into a span of time nearly 2,000 years in length? So in conclusion, the entire Olivet Discourse is clearly united and about one subject. No division into a discussion of two separate events separated by thousands of years can be substantiated. The end of the age and the coming of the Son of Man in Matthew 24:3 are simply referred to as these things in Mark and Luke, and all three versions say all these things would be fulfilled in the first century. The coming of the Son of Man always must refer to the first century coming anyway, since it is a reference to Daniel 7, which was fulfilled during the time of the fourth beast, which was the ancient Roman Empire, and this coming of the Son of Man is repeatedly referred to in the second half of the discourse. The idea that the disciples were confused is utter nonsense, because Jesus nowhere corrects them, nor does the text say they were confused, but every other time they are in error, this is made very clear. Daniel 12 itself conflates the end of the age with the abomination of desolation, and so does Jesus in Matthew 24:14-15. The chiastic structure of the discourse and the chiastic structure of Matthew's whole gospel demand that the whole discourse be about the end of Old Covenant Israel, and elements of the second half of the discourse are mixed with elements of the first half in Luke 17, which is clearly about AD 70. And as Gary DeMar shows, many of the objections to the unity of the discourse simply do not hold any weight. However, there are more objections I haven't covered yet, as well as more positive evidence I haven't covered yet either. Kenneth Gentry actually lists 13 arguments in his book, The Olivet Discourse Made Easy, for why the discourse should be divided, and I haven't touched on most of them yet, though Jonathan Sedlak does directly address all of them in his book. He also has other arguments besides those 13, and even for the ones I have touched on, more can be said in response. So in my next video, I will continue my argument for the unity of the discourse and demonstrate even further why Gentry and many other commentators must be wrong on this. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. God bless.